This is chapter 12, part 2. We finished the last segment getting into the experience and the different phases of an LSD high. We started off with the sort of initial few minutes where you feel that you get this sort of increase in heart rate and other physiological functions, got a little bit of a cranking up of the system, followed by feelings of possibly restlessness or euphoria. You might, this uplifting kind of feeling might be accompanied by laughing, by crying, depending on circumstances. But now, between 30 minutes and 2 hours after this initial phase, a quote-unquote psychedelic trip begins, characterized by a number of distinctive features. So I've listed, taken from the textbook here, these distinctive features. The first one here being images seen with the eyes closed. So again, you're seeing images that are sort of hallucinations. That they're things. Even though your eyes are closed, you're seeing images of things. So in the chapter, it gets into sort of like the difference between a real hallucination and what happens during an LSD high. But we'll talk about that later. Number 2, an intermingling of senses called synesthesia, which usually involves sounds being perceived as hallucinatory visions. This is actually this synesthesia, which can be experienced during these LSD highs. It's actually a condition that some people have where their brain is wired in a way where they may experience one type of stimulation using what other senses. So, for example, if you were to, in your mind, hear music and seeing certain images or colors or something, that instead of just simply hearing the notes, it's like different sensory systems kicking in and being activated than what you would expect, where you're seeing, your visual system is working when you're listening to something, some sound, or vice versa, or et cetera, et cetera. So this is an example of one system kind of taking over for another one. So you're hearing sounds, but you're actually seeing the sounds. You're having hallucinatory visual experiences of these sounds. Number 3, perception of a multi-level reality. Okay, so not just the simple, what you see is what you get, but something seems like something more complicated, complex is going on there. And number 4, strange and exaggerated configurations of common objects or experiences. So again, the things that you do see, the things you normally experience, become distorted, become exaggerated, become strange, and kind of bizarre, not what you normally perceive. During the third and final phase, approximately 3 to 5 hours after first taking LSD, the following features begin to appear. So you can see, before I jump into those, you can see sort of the complexity of this high, that it lasts a long time, that there's various phases that are quite, different from each other. And so it's sort of, it's a high with, several different parts to it. So this number 1 here is great swings in emotions or feelings of panic. So we could have some negative emotions here as well as positive ones, but great swings from high to low, from happiness to terror or something, is an example of sort of very different kinds of emotions. A feeling of timelessness, that the sense of time gets lost, and you sort of have lose the sense of how long things have been happening. Number 3, a feeling of ego disintegration. And this is kind of a fancy term, but all I mean by that is that normally we have a sense of ourselves being separate from everything else. So there's us and there's our surroundings. There's us, there's other people, there's the room that we're in or the space that we're in, and we know the difference between us and these other things. Well, what they mean by ego disintegration is you may lose that sense of self, that there's me and everything else. You might feel like you're blending, your mind, yourself is blending with other things, or that your mind might be separating from the body and merging, blending with other things separate from the body. So there's this separation kind of effect. Separation, but also maybe merging with other things at the same time. So there's the boundaries of what's you and what's not you can be distorted or sort of erased or diminished. Number 4, whether any of all these strong reactions result in a quote-unquote good trip or a bad trip depends heavily on the user's expectations. So again, if you're in a comfortable place, if you're surrounded by people who are supportive and that are making you feel comfortable, that you're going to be, would be more likely that you have a good experience, because there's a lot of psychology involved here. And if instead you are in sort of a less safe, more threatening set of surroundings, then the high could take on more of this bad trip experience, a negative experience, because little things could get blown up into big negative things. Again, it sort of depends on context and what you're expecting, and so there's quite a bit of psychology there. LSD closely resembles the molecular structure of serotonin. Okay, we talked about that in that list, the categories of different hallucinogens before. So it's similar to serotonin. Now, they don't really talk about serotonin too much, like what it does in your brain. But let me just say, it's a complicated thing, but let me say that if you have the right proper amounts of serotonin, you're more likely to feel peaceful, to feel good, to not feel anxious, to not feel depressed, to not feel moody, but to sort of a feeling of contentedness. Not necessarily super high like dopamine, which gives you this really powerful kind of reward, pleasure reward. It's more like a well-being kind of feeling if you've got the right amount of serotonin. Anyway, it's not surprising that LSD should have effects on receptors in the brain that are sensitive to serotonin, and LSD experiences should be related to serotonin activity. So again, there's clearly a connection there. The critical factor behind LSD's hallucinogenic effects is its ability to stimulate a specific type of serotonin-sensitive receptor called serotonin 2A receptors. So to get a little more specific, it's not just serotonin or serotonin receptors, it's a particular subtype. This is all very complicated. Just realize that, if nothing else, what you should walk away from with this is knowing that these drugs are working because they have certain specific chemical structures that are similar to chemicals, biochemicals working in your brain to make you feel and perceive things in a certain way. So that's to me makes perfect sense, that there's going to be some similarities in structure to have the same sort of effects on you. All hallucinogens, even those drugs whose structures do not necessarily resemble serotonin, are linked together by a common ability to excite these particular receptors. And just to remind you, what receptors were we talking about? The serotonin 2A receptors, a subtype. All of these hallucinogens work on those receptors. The ability of a particular drug to produce hallucinogenic effects is directly proportional to its ability to bind to serotonin 2A receptors. So to put that in other words, the better that it binds to those receptors, the better the particular drug binds to those receptors, the stronger the hallucinogenic effect. It's going to work better the more that it binds more strongly to these receptors. Drugs that specifically block serotonin 2A receptors, so this is the opposite kind of a drug, not a type of drug that doesn't activate these receptors but blocks them, leaving all other subtypes unchanged, will block the behavioral effects of hallucinogens. So that's the flip side of it. If you have a drug that will block that, those receptors, then you're not going to get the hallucinogenic effect from the drugs. It's basically blocking the way this whole thing works. Okay, now the next thing that we want to, so that's kind of covering how how this is working in your brain and the effects that people feel, the stages, the phases that they're moving through in this rather long high. Now let's switch over to a few basic stats. As usual, I don't focus on the textbook stats because they're always dated. They're always older than I would like. And even fresh stats don't satisfy me because they're not that new. But I went out and I got just a few basic stats to give us a sense of use of LSD. Again, a major hallucinogen, at least traditionally. What you see here is this graph in front of you is the y-axis is the percent who used LSD ever, like lifetime. So, but these are kids. These are 8th graders. These are 12th graders. Actually, you've got various grades going from 6th up to 12th grade, and this is lifetime. So you're gonna tend to get larger and larger numbers the older the kids are because it's a lifetime thing, right? Then on your x-axis, you've got the years that we're looking at going all the way back to 1969. So they've been doing these surveys for a very long time, and starting in 1969 and then maxing out over here at about 2022. Again, I always wish we had more cutting edge, fresh data, but this is the best I could do. What you see is very clear pattern for all these grades, which is that if we break it up into sort of decades, the 70s, you see fairly high usage of LSD. It was tried, again, you see over on the y-axis, we're talking there's 3, 6, 9%. If we focus on the seniors, because again, it's going to be higher among seniors because they've had more years to try LSD. That LSD was tried, about somewhere between 6 and 9% in the 70s and in the 80s. But then you get an increase in the 90s, and then a quick drop off. Once you get into this century, you start to get into the aughts there, and it drops precipitously, dramatically. We're peaking there at about 1997, at about 13-14% of kids have tried it. And then it just drops dramatically within a few, and it bottoms out by about 2004, 2005. And it's slipped up gradually a little higher than that in the past decade, but still we're talking, no more than you see a peak there of about 6% in 2020. So it's just a lot lower, even though it's come up a little bit in some recent years. It's still very low compared to the 90s, definitely the 90s, and even the 80s and the 70s. You can see that those were pretty high numbers in the earliest years, in the early 70s, because that was a time of experimentation. This drug was kind of a new experience, and a lot of people were trying it out because it's newness. And we've got a couple highlighted points coming up here that the drug has come to be seen as being riskier, more dangerous, and also as being less available in recent years. And so that helps explain why you see lower numbers in the past couple decades as opposed to previous times. So second, we got first table here. You've seen this table before. It does a good job of kind of looking at all of these different major types of drugs. And I was glad to see that this specifically had LSD on it. You can see this is recent, I think just a year or two old. And this is like past month. Have you used LSD in the past month? And you can see the number is very low for basically teenagers here, for youths. You've got if we round, about 1% have used it in the past year. That's a low percentage. And same thing, slightly higher, but basically the same for grown-ups. Now I've got some other data here that might disagree with that a little bit. That use different data, sometimes you get a different story. But I think the big takeaway here is the percent of kids or grown-ups who have used in the past year is low. It's not a drug that's widely used nowadays. It was more so in the past. And another way to get a comparison is compare it with other drugs, where you can see, if we're talking about marijuana, for teenagers, roughly 10%, rounding to about 19% for adults. So, something like marijuana would be a drug that's much more commonly used than something like LSD. So LSD is not a commonly used drug, and you can compare it to other things as well. You can see here that there's that a lot of these drugs aren't used that much, and LSD is one of those that has a smaller number. Now, just a couple of written stats as opposed to the graphs and tables. In 2023, the lifetime, meaning ever having taken LSD, and in the past 12 months, prevalence of taking LSD, stayed steady or trended down, bringing levels to record or near record levels. So the newest data that I could find, 2023, says, hey, we're about as low as we've ever been on people trying this in the past year or over their lifetimes. So it's just not a trendy drug that's getting used a lot nowadays. It was one of the first drugs to decline at the start of the 80s. You had a real peak with a lot of drugs around 1980. You had a peak after the 70s, a lot of use in the 70s, and then a dropping a lot with quite a few drugs in the 80s. And LSD did drop in the 80s, and this was almost surely due to more information about dangers. I don't know that I've stressed this enough, that research clearly shows that fewer people are going to use a drug if, number one, they think it's dangerous, risky, hazardous, not safe. They don't take it if they think it's not safe. Number one, that's very strong in the findings. People also don't take it if they perceive that it's not easily available. If it's hard to get, hard to find, you're just going to get fewer number of people. A lot of people are not super motivated to try something. They might be open to trying something, but they're not super motivated to hunt it down if it's really hard to find. But they might be willing to try it if it's easily available. If it's right there, they might give it a shot. So the availability and perception of dangerousness are two major factors for all these different kinds of drugs. Let's stop there and continue on in part 3.